Hello everybody, Prepper003 here today with another SHTF concept video for you, and this is going to be terror attacks. Now I know that a lot of you are kind of wondering why terror attacks. They're not something typically that a lot of us think about as a long-term SHTF scenario or as really a short-term SHTF scenario. A lot of them are very quick and they only last for maybe minutes to maybe days, but they're not something that we need to prep specifically long term for. And I'm going to really kind of tell you guys why that might be a little bit of a falsehood to think that, and also some of the things on why a terror attacks or a series of terror attacks is a SHTF scenario. So first off is going to be there's a multitude of different types of terror attacks. And right now I'm just going to kind of go over some of the more common ones that we see on a more day-to-day basis. Bombings, whether it be your standard car bomb, a suicide bomber, or a planted bomb, something like an IED that we saw, for example, at the Boston Marathon bombings. Then there is the shootings, which are more along lines of politically or agenda motivated, but they still are technically terror attacks, and they can still have very essential values on what we do and the way our laws are processed, and also how we do things in our schools, in our businesses, or even at the standard institutions where we work and live. So then there's something that's become much more common as of now, especially over in Europe, and that's going to be vehicular attacks, to where people are getting run down in the dozens by people using vehicles as a tool or instrument of their terror attack, at which they might move on to using a firearm or a knife after they've totaled their vehicle. But the main attack and the main amount of carnage is caused by said vehicle, which could even be put into being a vehicle VED or vehicular explosive. Oh, vehicular improvised explosive, sorry. Then there are riots, and riots, they could technically be put under the concept of terrorism depending on how they're organized and on how the riot goes. Then there's mass stabbings, which is something that's become very prevalent of happening, especially in the UK. There's chemical attacks, which we all kind of know about as a general idea for like dirty bombs and such. And there is industrial attacks, which is something that we don't really think about much too often, like attacks on the electrical grid, attacks on different types of industries, whether it be attacking for example, the sewage systems, attacking the city infrastructure for a gas main, things along those lines, which can very well happen, as these are soft targets that aren't very well secured, yet are very easily able to be attacked and manipulated and damaged, which can cause a massive amount of fear and destruction inside of a city. So why are terror attacks such a big, why are they such a big threat? Well, one of the things is that it's very hard to really prepare for them, because they can be either very random or they can be very, on the flip side, very coordinated. So what do I mean by they can be very random? Sure, for people in the intelligence community and that are watching all of these and reading all the channels and everything else, to the point to where they're able to maybe guesstimate where there's an attack that's going to happen, or they might be able to follow the breadcrumbs, if you will, and be able to apprehend said suspects before the attack happens. But in the end, they still, for the most part, for us civilians, we don't know when an attack is going to happen. We don't even know if there's been an arrest on a terror attack until the media reports it. And even then, it's only big news for maybe a couple of days or so, and then it's forgotten. So that's why terror attacks can be very prevalent, especially because we just don't know when they can happen. Well, they might happen as on the flip side to something more prevalent, like, for example, hurricanes or other types of natural disasters. Like, we can kind of gauge whenever there's going to be some type of volcanic activity by watching the seismology studies and reports, or we can kind of gauge when there's going to be a bad storm coming in by watching the Weather Channel, or we can kind of gauge when there's going to be financial strife by watching the stock markets and such, on etc. To the point where we can kind of gauge when other types of disasters and SHTF scenarios might be coming into play. As terror attacks, we might know when they might be motivated With, like, for example, whenever there's calls for certain type of political figures to step down or things like that, you can have people on one side or the other type of psychology go and actually carry out attacks against another party or another politically organized group or other different religions or even whole different nations. So that's just an example of how some ways you can kind of gauge it, but right now, just for the average citizen to try to do that on a daily basis would be very difficult, to the point where you don't know if the time you're going out to a, just for example, like a Christmas pageant or something, and all of a sudden somebody's shooting it up because they don't like Christianity, just as a thought. Now, I'm just going to talk about just a little bit on how a coordinated attack can actually build up into being a long-term SHTF scenario, as I kind of pointed to in the opening here. A stage of terror attacks to where they're coordinated, they're well thought out, and they're well planned can actually be and lead to a long-term SHTF scenario. For example, if you have a well-trained, well-planned amount of groups throughout a certain area of the nation to carry out a strategic and well thought out attack on the electrical grid, you could easily take down, just with a small arms, like for example just some high powered rifles, you'd be able to take out a good amount of substations and be able to eventually cause massive blackouts throughout the grid, which can cause more strain on the rest of the grid, therefore shutting the grid down. Sure, you might have places like Texas, which just has its own kind of encased grid, be able to be self-sustained for a while, but overall in the end it could even be strained by other outlying areas to the point to where it might even get damaged, or an attack might happen directly on their grid as well. So that just comes down to the point to where these attacks can actually cause even more damage as a domino effect happens, to where now that the grid is down, you're going to have traffic jams. Therefore, you're going to have cuts to the food supply, and then you're going to have people rioting for food because they're not having that food delivered onto their shelves and into their kitchens like they're used to on an almost daily basis, because they haven't provided for themselves or they haven't prepped and they're just completely unprepared for such an event, which can lead down to a collapse of society and in there and after just a full-on collapse of the nation, because we're unable to sustain ourselves and we're unable to sustain our ecosystem and our, well, not ecosystem, but economy with that amount of stuff going on, because a lot of us use credit cards, debit cards, and some type of electrical system. We're not taking checks to the bank where it's being auto-deposited for us. So there, and you're having just a lot of issues and a lot of things coming down just by taking on very small, thought-out attacks rather than just carrying out a whole bunch of one long waged-out war. So therefore, having these very small lone wolf groups attacking can be very damaging and have a very long-standing effect on the nation for a long-term SHTF scenario. Another thing about these terror attacks is they can cause fear, to the point to where if you're having a hospital or a roadway bombed every week or so, there's going to be people that are going to be afraid to go to very crowded locations. They're going to be afraid to go to the city. They're going to be afraid to some even go outside their door, like we saw during the Boston Marathon bombing, where martial law was put in place to where they weren't able to leave outside their house while they were searching for that bombing suspect. So that can just be a thing that can very well happen, to the point where people don't want to leave their houses because of the fear of these attacks. And it also depends on what type of attacks are happening. If there's just a back-to-back amount of chemical attacks happening in almost every major city, one week after another, a lot of things are going to happen, which can cause other effects and other type of scenarios to fall well on after. But the biggest thing is, especially with terror attacks, is that inbuilt fear that comes with them. So that's pretty much it. Right now I'm going to try to, the best thing that I can really think of, a way to prepare for an SHTF, well, a terror attack really would just be to stay pretty much, try to stay aware of your surroundings, stay aware of suspicious people, try to avoid large groups, if you will, or type of events. I know some people, you might not be able to avoid a Christmas pageant that your daughter or son is participating in, but if you are or are into one of these large groups, try to maintain some type of, if you can, way to defending yourself. Try to know where the exits are, try to know where different types of things are that you might be able to defend yourself with, because for a lot of places where these attacks happen, the standard citizen isn't allowed to carry a firearm, or if they do have a firearm, they're normally able to subdue or hold off that type of situation, but the attack still can take place, especially when we've seen, like, for example, that Paris attack. Even when armed officers arrived, they were still overwhelmed by the amount of coordinated effort and on the amount of level that they had planned out that attack. So I do know that one thing I would definitely advise is having some type of medical supplies on you at all times. I know some people might not want to carry medical supplies, but maybe having it inside of a get-home bag or in your vehicle, but having some type of first aid supplies that's for managing trauma and hemorrhaging is something I can definitely recommend, just for standard everyday purposes. You never know when you might need it, but that's just another thing that I can really say to have on you. But beyond that, preparing for a whole slew of different types of random terror attacks, even some that might not even ever come, is something that's just very hard to prepare for, because, like I just said, you might never even be a part of a terror attack, or you might never be even in a state that has one. So, because I haven't heard of a terror attack that's ever happened in Idaho. So, just a type of thing to think about, and to really kind of just put your guys' thought process on, especially in the recent times that we're living in, and how terror attacks are becoming more and more prevalent, especially in Europe and the United States. So that's just a thing I can really say. I really want to hear your guys' thoughts on terror attacks for an SHTF scenario, if you guys would qualify it as an SHTF scenario, and that kind of thought process is as the same as a grid down scenario or financial collapse, kind of on the same level. So, like I said, I want to hear from you guys, what you guys had to say, and I just wanted to kind of poke the barrel a little bit on what you guys would qualify as terror attacks being a SHTF kind of situation. So, thank you. I really appreciate you guys watching, and remember, those that prepare for today survive tomorrow.